What if I told you nearly 73% of merger and acquisition fail to create a shareholder value? Imagine spending 40,000 crores, 80,000 crore and even 3 lakh crores acquiring another company only to make you and your shareholders more poor. Sounds unbelievable, right? Yet it happens every single year. Here's a big surprise. Companies continue acquiring businesses despite knowing these odds. Why? Because when an acquisition succeeds, the company's future transforms completely. Think about Tech Mahindra acquiring Satyam or UltraTech acquiring Jaypee. On the other hand, look at Vodafone and Idea and Tata Steel and Corus. Same strategy but completely different outcome. So real question isn't do merger create value? The real question is what separates a $1 billion success from a $1 billion failure? Today we are going to answer that exact same thing using real Indian case studies, financial analysis and frameworks that I developed using and studying 5 landmark acquisitions. So without a further ado, let's dive into it. After analyzing more than 6.5 lakh crore worth of acquisitions, studying 127 finance professionals and reviewing more than 50 plus research papers, one conclusion became impossible to ignore. Mergers don't create value automatically. They create value only these 5 conditions work together. I call this a VALUE framework, value framework, where V stands for valuation discipline, A stands for strategic alignment, L stands for leverage management, U stands for unlocking synergies, and E stands for execution excellence. Miss even one and your probability of destroying the shareholder wealth increases dramatically and it compounds. Let's understand the further concepts using a story. Let's assume you are a CEO. So, why would you spend billions of rupees acquiring another company instead of growing naturally? There can be only 5 major reasons. First, you want to enter a new market overnight. For example, Sun Pharma didn't spend decades entering 55 countries. Moreover, they acquired a company that was actively participating in the market in 55 countries. Therefore, they acquired Rabaxi. Second, diversification. When one industry slows down, another keeps generating profits. Thus, company go for this process. Third, defensive acquisitions. For example, when Vodafone and Idea merged because of Reliance Jio was completely disrupting the telecom industry. The problem, defensive merger rarely produce any extraordinary value. Fourth, compatibility acquisition. Sometimes you aren't buying only factories, you are buying talent, technology, intellectual property, and the customers. Finally, the industry consolidation. For example, UltraTech Cement became India's largest cement manufacturer by simply buying the competitors. Notice something interesting. None of these reasons guarantee success. They only explain why companies acquire. They don't explain why most acquisitions fail. That's where things become fascinating. Here's one of the biggest paradoxes of the corporate finance. The moment an acquisition is announced, shareholders of the company are being acquired become richer, but the shareholders of the acquiring company often become poorer. Why? Because markets immediately ask one question. Did this company pay way too much? And that's exactly the problem this research tries to solve. Finance professors have debated on mergers for almost 60 years. One group believes synergies create value. Another believes CEO become overconfident. Economists argue that firms merge to reduce transactional costs. Strategic experts believe companies acquire unique capabilities. Each theory explains one part of the puzzle, but none explains the entire picture. That's why I integrated all of them into a single practical consulting framework. Rather than relying on opinions, I wanted evidence. So I combined 3 different approaches: financial statement analysis, 5 landmark case studies, and an insight from 127 professionals working on investment banking, consulting, private equity, and corporate finance. The combination allowed me to validate every single conclusion from multiple perspectives. Now let's get into the case studies. Let's start with probably the most controversial acquisition of the Indian corporate history. Tata Steel wanted the global dominance. Strategically, the idea was brilliant. Financially, it became a nightmare. Tata paid a 34% of the premium, financed most of the acquisition using a debt. Then came the global financial crisis. steel demand collapsed, debt exploded, EBITDA margin crashed. What looked like an ambitious acquisition became nearly a decade of value destruction. The lesson? A great company purchased at a wrong price becomes a bad investment. Now, let's compare that with HDFC. No bidding war, no excessive premium, no massive leverage. Instead, this merger simplified regulations, improved capital allocation, and unlocked cross-selling opportunities across millions of customers. That is what we call as a strategic elegance. Now, here's my favorite acquisition. Tech Mahindra bought Satyam after India's biggest corporate fraud. Everyone saw a broken company. Tech Mahindra saw a hidden value. 53,000 engineers, 100 of Fortune 500 clients, global delivery capabilities. They bought quality asset at a distressed price. Today, the acquisition is considered as one of the India's greatest turnaround stories. Now, UltraTech repeated exactly the same principle. Buy below intrinsic value, integrated rapidly, standardized operations, generated cost synergies. That's consulting great capital allocation. And finally, Vodafone and Idea. The merger wasn't driven by opportunity, it was driven by survival. Mass depth, regulatory uncertainties, AGR liabilities, integration challenges. This became the perfect example of what happens when strategy becomes reactive instead of proactive. When we compare all 5 acquisitions, one pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Every successful deal had a disciplined pricing. Every failed deal carried excessive leverage. Price mattered more than the ambition itself. Everything that we have discussed so far lead to one practical framework. Before approving any acquisitions, ask these 5 questions. First, is the valuation disciplined? Second, does it align with the strategy? Third, can leverage survive a severe downturn? Fourth, are synergies realistic? Fifth, is the execution team ready? If the answer to even one question out of this 5 is no, the acquisition should not be proceeded. If I were to be advising a corporate board tomorrow morning, these would be my 4 recommendations. Never approve an acquisition without an independent valuation. Stress test every acquisition under worst case scenarios and conditions. Build a dedicated integrated office before closing the deal and monitor synergies for at least 3 years after the acquisition. So, do mergers and acquisition create shareholder value? The answer is yes. Because M&A isn't gambling, it is a disciplined capital allocation. The winners don't simply buy companies, they buy the right companies at the right price with the right financing and execute it with relentless discipline. That is the difference between Tech Mahindra and Vodafone Idea. That is the difference between UltraTech and Tata Steel merging with Corus. The lesson isn't to avoid acquisitions, the lesson is to avoid bad acquisitions. Because in corporate finance, the price you pay determines the value you create. Thus, make sure to have these instilled while you are doing a merger and acquisition. Thank you for watching. If you have enjoyed this deep dive into corporate finance strategy and merger and acquisitions, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comment. Which Indian acquisition do you think created the most shareholder value and why? I'd love to hear your perspective. Till then, stay curious.